Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lizette Coley, and as the Executive Director of Parapsychology Foundation, and on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our President, Mrs. Eileen Coley, I welcome you all here to this evening's Perspective Lecture. We're very pleased to have as our speaker tonight the Reverend Canon WIlliam Rauscher. He's been a long-time friend to psychical research and the science of parapsychology for decades. He was often found in the 1960s within the Eileen J. Garrett Library, just located on 57th Street at that point in time. So he became very well acquainted with the Parapsychology Foundation's founder, Eileen J. Garrett. And I can personally attest, as her granddaughter, that not only did she value his unique talents, she personally was very fond of him, as the rest of the family remains today. He was a grantee of the foundation under Mrs. Garrett, and also attended some of our international conferences, which were held at our then regional headquarters in the south of France at Lourdes. His affiliation with PF aside, he is a retired Episcopal priest with 40 years of parish experience, and he served in his last parish for 36 years. His lecture tonight is the subject of his latest book, The Houdini Code Mystery, A Spirit's Secret Solved. This psychic detective story involves a series of complex, intriguing personalities, which I think you must have had an affinity for, no? For sure, who caused a firestorm of media publicity. His other books, such as The Spiritual Frontier, A Priest Explores the Psychic World, and maybe you see some of them here, help to place the so-called psychic revolution in context and in perspective for those seeking good sense in the midst of such nonsense that was going on at the time. He has known many psychics and mediums, and was the literary legatee for Arthur Ford, and also the co-author of Ford's biography. From 64 to 68, he served as the president of the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship, where he tried to sculpt that organization similar to the Church's Fellowship in England. Under his leadership, up to 2,000 once attended their annual conference, and the SSF Journal flourished and reached thousands. His knowledge of stage magic and the field of mentalism are an asset for all researchers in the world. Like some researchers and leaders of the past, he belongs to England's Magic Circle, and for 50 years, the International Brotherhood of Magicians. His interest in ascetical and mystical theology, consciousness and awareness studies, I'm glad you did that, not me. His consciousness and awareness studies all provide for what we must all agree, to say the least, is for a very interesting background. He's an honorary canon of Trinity Cathedral, Trenton, New Jersey, and presently resides in Woodbury. Now, personally, I can't wait to have the Houdini mystery solved. So before we get to read his very fine book, I'm going to turn you over to his very capable hands, William Rauscher.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Lizette and Mrs. Coley. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am very, very privileged to be here, and I wish to say in the beginning that in my heart I owe a great debt to the Parapsychology Foundation. I characterize myself more as a psychic researcher than a formal parapsychologist. Although I'm conversant and well acquainted with parapsychology for many years, of course I have not been active in the statistical field. My contribution has been more in the experiential side of discovering the mystical and paranormal interpretations of direct contact with countless personalities and events. And I feel that I have been blessed with perhaps a great deal of practical experience. Like the archaeologist, you know, you don't find anything unless you go and dig. Like the chemist, you don't find anything unless you do your experiments. Otherwise, you're going to just rehash all the time what other people did at a certain time. So I have plowed the boards, as they say, with many unusual personalities. And as my mother said to me not long ago, she said, you know, Billy, she still calls me, she said, how do you meet all these unusual, strange people? Well, I rather like unusual, strange people. I feel that they are part of the fabric of our culture, and they are certainly very interesting. And in respect to all of that, in these beginning remarks, it was not so much that one thing was true or not true, but for me, it evolves into a preponderance of evidence that leads to some conclusions about the complexities of mind, body, space, time, and this lovely word that we use so much, the paranormal. Perhaps I have tried to reflect in relation to parapsychology what Dr. Rhine once told me. I asked him once why he had spent his life trying to prove the extra senses. And he looked at me very kindly and he said, I have given my life to these studies because if they can be proven as true, I feel in my heart that it may help people to behave better. It's an interesting perspective. In other words, if you have a transcendental dimension in your life, if you are open to other dimensional systems, if you are interested in consciousness and how it functions on all its various levels, that certainly lifts you from a horizontal level of life forever into some kind of vertical association. And that, he felt, has a changing effect. And I was always impressed with what Dr. Gardner Murphy said when I invited him to speak in my church, and that was October 29th, 1967, to the very challenging question, does psychical research and parapsychology have meaning for religion? His reply was, if your religion is big enough. Well, my religion has always been big enough. And, of course, I've always tried to see in these areas some implication for the religious impulse. For example, if we had a speaker on dream research, what would that say in terms, say, of those stories biblically where where pilot wife goes home, says, I have nothing to do with pilot, where the wise men go home another way because of the dream. So all these are implications. So I've always loved mystery. And I remember as a youth listening to that radio program, I Love a Mystery, a Carlton E. Morse adventure series of Jack, Doc, and Reggie. I've always allowed for a margin of mystery. Now, some people believe absolutely nothing. Some people believe something. And some people just believe anything and everything. They offer no alternative explanations in their own mind. They're just an open sieve to impressionism. Well, I believe something is there. And like that book by Mrs. Garrett, there is around all this that sense and nonsense of the entire field. And as Mrs. Garrett once said to me, you dabble at your own risk, Billy. And it is true. It is true. During the psychic revolution, people were dabbling like crazy. And some of them went off the edge. Well, that's why I think that my interest in magic has been important for me, only because I think it has given me some kind of perceptive insight into some of these things as a kind of interpretive aspect where I can distinguish a little bit better between what may be ultimate or utter fraud and what may be partly and what may be true. So I think parapsychology on its best levels could use some interpretation from the magic community, provided that they find the people in the magic community that are open to an understanding of these subjects and not just out to do something to enhance their own reputation. In other words, fool you, and because you have a PhD, and then love the fact that they fooled you, write it up, and you appear in paper as the fool, and they appear as the wise one. That's not the approach I think that parapsychology needs from magic. Well, my subject tonight is a kind of smorgasbord of personalities from a crazy time. They're all enigmatic, but they're certainly colorful. We have, in order of appearance, on the bill, Harry Handcuff Houdini, his wife Bess, and of course the controversial medium Arthur Ford. Now I say controversial because mediumship is of course controversial, and survival, as most of you know, some of your guests may not know, is the most controversial area of psychical research. There are many others along the way. Houdini, born in Budapest, March 24th, 1874, 126 years ago, and still being talked about, created his own immortality, lived 52 years, packed with a dozen lifetimes, essentially a vaudeville escape artist with great charisma on stage, a powerful performer, a fantastic showman, not necessarily the great magician, as people do believe today, which has been created into a myth almost gone mad, but he is now a household word, and himself with those around him and those who came after him created his own immortality. Dead 74 years. Toward the end of his career, when vaudeville wanes, movies come in, there is still this tremendous compulsive need to be known, to be admired, to have prominence, to have constant publicity, and of course he enters a field in which he gains tremendous notoriety in exposing mediums. And he gains fame as probably the greatest medium baiter of all time. He was dominating, he was ruthless, he was a tyrant, he was a verbal hurricane, he did lie, he was a moral man, but not so often not ethical, and possessed of an ego that bordered on the incredible. His mania for publicity was greater than any truth he may have found, and skeptics today tout him as their psychic research benefactor. Now, he is just about canonized in the magic fraternity, but his real personality profile turns out to be pretty much what the late author, magic authority, writer, Walter B. Gibson said to me once. He says, the only thing you can be sure of about Houdini, Bill, is that you can't be sure of anything. Although he was a great showman, his foray into psychic research irked and irritated everyone that he ever came in contact with. He had a marvelous ability to antagonize anyone he ever worked with. The Marjorie case is a tremendous example. His aggressiveness turned it all into an incredible circus in which people went down like flies, and he came back like a 10-millimeter cannon, like a Gatling gun. Nobody ever heard of J. Malcolm Bird after Houdini got through. He just vanished from the face of the earth. Marjorie was somewhat distraught. Houdini went on the stage exposing what we're not even sure was total exposure, because it was the gospel according to Houdini. His friendship with Conan Doyle ended in total disaster. Conan Doyle may have been naive about many aspects of fraud, but let me tell you something, he was a far better man than Houdini. Walter Franklin Prince, that prince of researchers, went along with Houdini, but never considered Houdini a real psychic researcher. He stirred the pot in every instance. He had hired hands that went from medium to medium, trapping them. He had one lady that was permanently employed, Rose Mackenberg, a very interesting lady who would don all the disguises that you'd think of, especially the one of a grieving widow. And she would go to every medium or psychic in town, and she would pretend to be bereaved. And then when Houdini held his performance in a theater, he would accuse the psychics or the mediums of fraud, and they would stand up and say they weren't fraudulent. And then Rose would stand up and yell, yes, they were. And the first thing you know, you had a panic situation in which Rose then revealed that she wrote her name in back of the picture in the living room where she had the sitting at the psychic or medium's house. So it was absolute chaos with Houdini, whatever happened. More about him later. His wife, Bess, Wilhelmina Beatrice Radner, was his constant companion since their days in the circus and carnivals when they worked a mind-reading code and once made money as phony mediums. He met her in Coney Island. Of course, he was Jewish, she was Catholic, and by then he had changed his name from Eric Wise to Houdini, having done that because of his admiration for Robert Houdin, the French conjurer, and took the end of that and made an I, and Houdin became Houdini. That's how that evolved. Well, as you well know, some of you, most of you, that the second half of the 19th century was an age of applied occultism. Spiritualism grew into favor, and with it came a deluge of so-called performers who did some remarkable things, such as the enigmatic Davenport brothers and their cabinet in which they were tied and held handfuls of flour, and the knots were sealed, and then the doors were shut, and all kinds of things happened. The tambourines flew, and the mandolins played, and then when they opened the doors, there they were tied with the flour in their hands, and they went on forever doing this, and gained tremendous historical prominence. Houdin, in 1848, was doing second sight, in which, you know, you would either be blindfolded or sealed in some way, and you could see. John Randall Brown was another gentleman in 1870 who was doing muscle reading, not necessarily reading your muscles, but in some way able to be led to something that was hid, such as a pin, and he would find it. Robert Heller was another one in 1877 who was doing supernatural vision. They have these wonderful titles for these things that are so interesting. For 40 years, all of this had been developing from its start in a farmhouse, naturally, in Hydesville, New York, with the Fox sisters in 1848. But in 1891, a paperback book appeared, a bombshell called Revelations of a Spirit Medium, or Spiritualistic Mysteries Exposed. It was a detailed explanation of the methods used by fraudulent mediums. Many of these were performers, by, quote, a medium. It sold for $1 and was copyrighted under the name of Charles Pigeon. Anyway, the young Eric Weiss by day and Houdini by night came upon a copy of this. And it utterly fascinated him because he read about how these people got out of ropes and knots when they were tied and did these things. And that gave him all kinds of flashes of ideas. He was fascinated. He was 17. And he learned about rope ties. And he was to become a relentless crusader against mediums with all this kind of knowledge as it built up through the years. Now, Bess, his wife, died February 11th, 1943, aboard a train from Los Angeles to the east. Incidentally, she died going through Needles, California, which they thought was very symbolic because Houdini used to do this trick with needles. But she had just finished a bowl of chili. And after that, she passed on. Well, when she did, she said, "When I go, I'll be gone for good. I won't even try to come back." That was what Bess said. When in 1913, Houdini's mother died, Cecilia Wise, he fainted when he was told about it. This was a man who truly was totally identified with his mother. Probably, if there was ever a case of momism, it would be Houdini with his dear mother. He couldn't perform. Years later, he read her letters over and over. They were buried with him in his casket under his head. And he began to make these pacts with friends for the idea that he would communicate back someday after he died. In the meantime, on this search, this subliminal, some kind of unconscious perhaps search, for his mother's presence, he went on this binge, quote unquote, of going to all these mediums of that era and trying to get some message that would give him a feeling that she was still alive. So he goes to countless seances. And of course, in the midst of all this, he becomes more and more angry with all of them. He exposes them. He masquerades to trap them. He does stage presentations on their fakery. He duplicates what they do. Even if they did do something real, you'd never know because he wouldn't have admitted it probably. No, he wouldn't have. He would duplicate it. He challenged them. He became obsessed with the subject and with the publicity that it gained him. He even went so far as to make a pact with his wife Bess. It was based on their old vaudeville mind-reading code. And it was supposed to be a complicated message that if it came through after he was dead, through some medium who happened to appear or got it, she would be the only one that would understand this thing, you see, and know that it was true. And that was to be the proof that Houdini would live, you see. Other than that, dead. I reminded of what did Charles Dickens write about in A Christmas Carol? Marley was dead, make no mistake about it, he was dead. So the first thing, Houdini is dead, period. That's it. Will he return through a code? Well, Houdini dies in 1936 on October 31st, Halloween. I always thought that that was a kind of anniversary syndrome that we all have. You know, if I could only live to my birthday, my gosh, wouldn't that be something? I'm the master of if I could only live till Halloween, we don't know. But he dies on Halloween. He's buried in Brooklyn beside his father and his mother and other members of the family. There's a monument with a stone bust designed by him. Bess tries to carry on. She opens up a tea shop, but she doesn't do very well because she goes broke because she gives all the magicians free lunch. And then she tries an act called Frozen in Ice, but that didn't work either. Frozen in Ice, that was a failure. Hardeen, Houdini's brother, goes on and does the show as the representative of Houdini's show. She had a standing offer of $10,000 to any spirit medium who could produce the code between she and Harry. Now this code was supposed to have been locked in a safe vault at Fifth Avenue Branch Manufacturers Trust, although nobody ever saw it from that time on. But in 1928, she withdrew that offer of $10,000. Prior to that, an Italian medium tried to get the code but failed. His name was Nino Pecoraro. He attempted to materialize Houdini. And the voice that came through, Pecoraro said, was his control, who he claimed was Eusebia Palladino. In 1928, now, there was a young, handsome pastor of the First Spiritualist Church in New York City here, and it was Arthur Ford. He was intelligent. He was a great speaker. He had never met Houdini. He had some academic credentials. He went to Transylvania College in Lexington, Kentucky, not to be confused with the Count. He was born in 1897, January 8th, in Titusville, Florida. He was eventually ordained in the Disciples of Christ Church. So right away you don't have somebody who's in a storefront somewhere. And his story is very much told in the biography, I don't know, The Man Who Talked with the Dead, which I still feel holds up very well. And of course, in his youth, as he develops, his story is that he hears voices, he has visions, and all of this eventually is put into perspective. And of course, he emerges as one of the most unusual mediums of the 20th century, with all kinds of questions and controversy. So, it was through the, quote, mediumship of this man that a message was delivered to Mrs. Houdini. And the message came on February 8th, 1928. And the message written by Mrs. Houdini said, "My dear Mr. Ford, today I received a special delivery letter signed by the members of the First Spiritualist Church who testified to purported message from Houdini's mother, received that the word forgive is the word Houdini awaited in vain all his life. It was indeed the message for which he always secretly hoped. And if it had been I can't read, I don't have it written down my eyes. While he was still alive, I know it would have changed the entire course of his life." So the word that Arthur Ford brings through that's delivered to Mrs. Houdini is the word forgive. Now this word had special meaning also because Houdini had a terrible problem with his brother Leopold, who left his wife for the wife of another brother in the family, and Houdini never forgave that, and his mother was very upset about it. And his mother, he interpreted, the message rather, was to interpret the fact that his mother was saying forgive to them regarding that brother's indiscretion. In fact, Leopold was not even admitted to the family cemetery until much later. So the word forgive was the beginning of all this towards the code. And Mrs. Houdini, when she got this, was stunned, you see. Now, whether she was sober or not, we don't know, because she had a terrible drinking problem, and that is known by those who are interested in all of this. It's part of the whole human picture. And this was the beginning of a future message based on this one word. And the word forgive was to unlock the rest in a series of 8 seances, covering a period of many weeks, so it didn't all just come at once. Now, Ford's spirit control was named Fletcher. Now, Fletcher was supposed to have joined Arthur Ford in 1924. Fletcher was supposed to have been a childhood playmate of Ford's. And there are generally, some of you know, but for those who are guests, 4 main theories about the anatomy of mediumistic controls. In this case, let us say Fletcher. 1. Fletcher was a pure invention of Arthur Ford, a pose, an act. 2. Fletcher was a secondary personality, more or less pathological, of the medium. 3. Fletcher was, as he claimed, a spirit. 4. Fletcher was, in the Jungian sense, an archetypal symbol. Now, I met Ford in 1954, and I knew him until his death in 1971. In that time, I had a chance to observe him quite extensively. I always found Fletcher consistent. Ford I found inconsistent. Fletcher was practical. Ford was totally impractical. In a way, as I think about it, and I have thought about it, I don't know. I think in some way I knew two people, no matter how you want to interpret it or explain it. Not all the time, but many times. Arthur Ford was a study in contrasts. Eileen Garrett warned me about Arthur Ford. She told me to be very careful. They all knew the others' backgrounds of the old days in this field. There was no comparison for me between an Arthur Ford and Eileen Garrett. You don't have any research background in terms of Ford. You have all kinds of research with Mrs. Garrett. It's a whole different venue. So we're not making those comparisons here. But I just mentioned, for example, Arthur Ford was not mystical at all, you see. I went with him, he gave a talk before 300 people. It was a wonderful talk. As soon as it was over, he said to me, let's get the hell out of here. Arthur Ford would never tell you that it was a nice day. He would never comment on the sunset. Mrs. Garrett had more of a transcendental dimension, more of a consciousness that expanded further. Eileen Garrett would comment on the sunset. She would observe things that had mystical meanings. She would look at the moon in a blazing fire on a hill and say, that moon will not let that fire dim its light. We wouldn't get anything like that out of an Arthur Ford or many of these other people. So you don't have a person in Ford that was ever research-minded, but he had a religious side, but not a mystical side. I wouldn't say that Arthur Ford was a spiritual man, not really in the least. He had a religious interest inside, but as far as sort of spirituality, no, because mediumship in itself is not necessarily spiritual. Spirituality has to do with union with God, a feeling of oneness. There's an element of disassociation in the subject of mediumship. And that is why so much of this went into the laboratory instead of going around and seeing who can do what. It was more important to try to establish certain things statistically. And Arthur Ford fought the battle of the bottle until his death. He was an afflicted man. A man, as Nandor Fodor would say, with a haunted mind. His dark side was very much in evidence. He was moody, he was humorous, he was downright difficult. He had this thing that the churches should be more interested in the psychic. Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship was dear to him, and a platform like the church's fellowship in England, which interested me greatly in its early days. Ford was a kind of everybody's medium, a kind of Johnny Appleseed, a severe critic of the church. He once told me, he says, I lived my whole life in suspicion. He didn't have an office. He didn't have a staff. He moved from place to place. He gave sittings all through his life in hotels and places. He used to say, I've slept for some of the best people in the world. The demands for sittings just went on and on and on. He was a very strange man. He was a mystery man. His frustrations were enormous at times. He used to say, I'm sick of hearing what's wrong with me from people who don't know anything about me. There are two things I'm tired of hearing. One is the business of if I'm evil from amateurs, and the other is the Houdini Code. Everyone asks about Houdini. Don't they want to know what is happening now or what I've done since? So there were many Arthur Fords. There was the clergyman, and in those moments very religious. There was Ford, the impatient and impetuous person. There was Ford who disliked organized religion. The next day he liked it. There was Ford on the platform. There was the strong-willed Ford, the Ford who liked to be by himself, the Ford who could not live with himself, with his guilt, with his alcoholism. There was the childlike Ford. If you were in a restaurant with him, a Chinese restaurant, when he'd look at the waiter and say, aren't you going to bring me a fortune cookie? There was the Ford who pondered the mental combinations that were his, introspective, in the midst of all this complexities. His mind, Fletcher's mind, the sitter's mind, the universal mind. I mean, he always said, can you be sure of any of this? Can you be sure of the information? It's not a radio. My mind's involved, Fletcher's mind's involved. One minute, he was very authentic in that, and the other minute, you didn't know. I had his funeral. At his last public appearance in Atlanta, Georgia, November 20th, 1971, this is what he said. "We have nothing new to tell you. We're simply trying to remind the church and the world at large of something very important, out of which all religions have been born, and without which there would be no church, the things which the church itself has largely forgotten or neglected." That was his aspect that he took. So this is the guy who supposedly gets the message from a dead Houdini. This is the man who William Lindsay Gresham called the enigma of our generation. Gresham wrote, "Wise as a serpent, gentle as a dove, is the Reverend Arthur Ford." What a tour de force. The Houdini Code. A combination, really, when you add it all up with all the characters of the Roaring Twenties and Ragtime all rolled into one. Now, back for a minute to the word forgive. Bess acknowledged it, saying any authentic communication of Mrs. Weiss would have to include the word forgive. But the word forgive was printed in the Brooklyn Eagle, March 13th, 1927. And it was also mentioned in a letter to Conan Doyle from Bess in 1926. Conan Doyle reminded her of it. Also in the Harry Kellogg book, commissioned by Mrs. Houdini, Houdini, His Life Story, which she authored to be written in 1928, published by Harcourt Brace. The strange thing is that Bess proceeds to acknowledge the correct word by the letter. And we said that it took 8 seances covering 10 weeks, and it all added up to 10 words. And the 10 words were: Rosabelle, answer, tell, pray, answer, look, tell, answer, answer, tell. Now, it was a simple code, as vaudeville mind-reading codes went, and they all used them. The 10 words or phrases each represented a number, which in turn indicated the position of a letter in the alphabet. In other words, if you knew all this, you could talk to somebody and give them, if they know it, but you wouldn't, you see. The word pray stood for the number 1, answer for 2, say for 3, now for 4, 5, tell for 5, please for 6, speak for 7, quickly for 8, look for 9, and be quick for 10. To convey B, the second letter in the alphabet, the word was answer. For E, the 5th letter, the code was tell. For L, the 12th letter in the alphabet, the code words were a pair, pray, answer. So it went. Then Ford, Fletcher, in Ford, begins to dictate the exact message to Mrs. Houdini. And she absolutely goes into spasm. She acknowledges the truth with tremendous excitement. And finally, in a private sitting at her home, Fletcher tells her, speaking for Houdini, the man who hated mediums, would have nothing to do with them, exposed them, championed his cause. Fletcher says to Mrs. Houdini, take off your wedding ring and tell them what Rosabelle means. Inside that ring was engraved the words of a song. She takes off the ring and she begins to sing in this weak voice, Rosabelle, sweet Rosabelle, I love you more than I can tell. Over me you cast a spell. I love you, my Rosabelle. And then the medium says, Fletcher says, for Houdini, I thank you, darling. The first time I heard you sing that was in our first show together years ago. And she nods. And then Fletcher says the zinger. He says, there is something that he wants to tell me that no one but his wife knows. He smiles now and shows me a picture and draws the curtains so, in this manner. And she responds in French, I draw the curtains so. He then gives a complicated description of the code and says, the message I want to send back to my wife is Rosabelle, believe. Fletcher then spoke for Houdini and said, tell the whole world that Harry Houdini still lives and will prove it 1,000 times and more. Well, she issues her statement of belief in the message on January 9th, 1929. This is how long it went on. And of course, the magicians, who are all friends of hers, come to her rescue to protect her. Scandal is attributed to Arthur Ford. He is taken up on charges in his church. The Graphic, that newspaper which will dwarf anything you could think of for a tabloid today, and its reporter Rene Jarret claims that it was all a hoax and that Mrs. Houdini it's all fraudulent, and the media blitz goes absolutely crazy. Headlines go all across the country. Medium exposer returns from the dead, and everybody goes like a nuclear blast on this thing. Could Ford have learned the code in some way? Was Mrs. Houdini tricked? Did Houdini have a girlfriend that might have known the code and told it? There's pressures, there are demands, there's threats. Daisy White gets involved. She was a friend of Houdini. Sophie Rosenblatt, Houdini's nurse, gets involved. Dunninger gets in the picture. But neither the word Rosabelle nor believe had ever been printed before. But they all knew the code. There was an old magician in New York named Al Flosso who married the daughter of a man named Krieger. And as a wedding present, Houdini gave Krieger a book with the code in it. So it was known. Then she rejects the whole thing. And she claims to later on still be waiting for this message. Now we can't go on forever with this. It's a very zany story and a very exciting, interesting story and very complex, but it's all in the book. And it became a ritual to then have a seance after she, of course, disavowed all this. And they've been having a yearly seance ever since. And they call it the official Houdini seance. And George Hansen, my friend, parapsychologist George Hansen, had a very good point. He said the only reason they have the seance is to prove that Houdini can't come back. Not that he can come back. But finally, on the 10th anniversary of his death, October 31st, 1936, her then live-in friend, Dr. Edward Saint, con man, former Coney Island Dreamland show manager, and a real character who used to do an act called The Living Statue, and the International Smileless Man, who used 30 different names, plus reverend, doctor, and degrees and ordinations that he bought, ran this final seance on the roof of the Hollywood Knickerbocker Hotel. For music, they used the opening music from Houdini's show, which was always Pomp and Circumstance. And after it's over, she makes a final statement and douses the light, which has been burning all these years, you say, and her final words are classical. Good night, Harry. Now, if we were here for this, and I just want you to hear a little bit of that, because Edward Saint, just the ending, Edward Saint was like a caricature of a Shakespearean actor. And they really knew how to do it.
Yes, that's the good part of you for 33 years. She's here, Harry, bleeding in her heart full of prearranged signs.
Yes.
It means so much to her, to all of us, to the world. Harry, we are all seekers after truth. Please manifest yourself by speaking to the trouble. Lift it. Speak to the given evidence to eternity. By thy love, I ask that you come still the evidence. By the love of the little silver-haired widow, by the love and esteem of the countless wife, the evidence, Harry, and Houdini, dash is listening in. Dash, are you your brother? Your brother has joined us.
Well, I just wanted you to hear that. It goes on a ways, and her voice is at the end, but we would take forever on this. But when the book Arthur Ford, The Man Who Talked with the Dead, came out in 1973, I made a number of guest appearances discussing it, and in that book is the expose of the Pike situation with Arthur Ford. Fortunately, I was the one that discovered the clippings that presented the Pike seance as Ford having had that information. So that went down the tube. But I was on the Barry Farber show, and I was a guest appearance there. And unknown to me, a man was listening whose name was J. Abbott, here in New York. And he wrote me. And this amazing letter arrived. And he said that he knew all about the Code Mystery, but that he had kept it a secret all these years. Well, needless to say, I went to see him on April 12, 1973. He was quite a guy. He was sane, he was lucid. In his case, he was a believing spiritualist. He had a sense of humor. He was very flamboyant in his old age, very colorful, very, very delightful. And his hobby was playing chimes rigged on an old birdcage stand, in which he played fascination, you say, all that kind of thing. I mean, it's the kind of people you can enjoy. But the important thing was that he pulled out letters from Arthur Ford and Mrs. Houdini, quite a number of them. So he substantiated in good faith his association with both of these people. His mother helped Mrs. Houdini, helped nurse her. And Mrs. Houdini told him that she and Arthur Ford were good friends. And they were. And that they dated. And that they even went dancing together. And that they both drank. And as he told this, his eyes went up. He says, "Oh, dear Arthur, forgive me. For God's sakes, forgive me." And one night, he said, Mrs. Houdini dropped her ring. And Ford picked it up. And inside was the inscription that he saw. And the end result, according to Abbott, was that they were in collusion and that the entire affair was planned and that it would promote both and also the name of Houdini. 3 months later, J. Abbott was dead of throat cancer. I never spoke to him again. I did get a number of the letters and a scrapbook that he had. One day, I was with Ford in his apartment in Philadelphia. He was living there then. And he was smoking a cigar. And he was staring out the window, pensively, as he often was, sort of. And I said to him, "Arthur, please, tell me about the Houdini Code." And he said, "I knew Mrs. Houdini. I never knew Houdini. They're all dead. Only I know." He says, "You know, I could have caused more of a stir if I wanted to." Nothing more was ever said. Arthur Ford once loaned me a copy of The Shoes of the Fisherman by Morris West. You know, he had a practice of underlining a book if you loaned him a book. And on thumbing through it, the pages of the West story, I noticed several places Ford had made notes. And I always thought that he read with an idea of himself in the story. And one sentence struck me that he had underlined in that book, on page 77. He underlined, "I have seen the worst that can happen to me, and I'm still here. The rest, whatever it is, I can endure. I'm sure that Ford saw himself in those words, and they do reflect a portion of his philosophy. He was complex, to say the least. And in the end, Arthur Ford cannot really just be cast off with a smirk. His ashes were strewn in the Atlantic Ocean. He didn't want them thrown in Biscayne Bay because he said it was already too polluted. But let me just end with a quotation that I gave to the former editor of some major newspapers and now, the author, Arthur Myers. He was doing a book at the time about ghosts of the rich and famous. But anyway, he asked me this question. He said, after knowing Ford so well, and after having studied Houdini's life and career so long, what do you believe happened in connection with the message? And what I said, I think, makes a fitting last word on the subject. If you wish to go further, you'd have to look and read the book. But and I said, my contention is that Arthur Ford and Bessie Houdini were in full cahoots. It was a mutually agreed upon grand and glorious hoax. Both were full partners, period. And personally, as for Ford, did he have mediumistic ability? Yes, I believe he did. Now, I'm saying that. I've had the experience. The world ends where your experience ends, or we'd all belong to the Flat Earth Society. But, yes, not all the time, but sometime. Did he cheat? Yes, he cheated. Did he cheat all the time? There are certain experiences with him that I still cannot fathom or understand. I say that as a result of all my experience with him. He was indeed a strange man. And I will give you one example that puzzles me to end. My first 3 years as an Episcopal rector was spent in a little church in Florence, New Jersey. That's near Roebling, where they made the steel for the Brooklyn Bridge. Many parishioners worked in this mill where my parishioners. It was also the headquarters, incidentally, of Hunt Brothers Circus. But anyway, I had met Ford through an organist when I was a seminarian my first year, who was an astrologer playing in the Episcopal little chapel in Fairhaven. She said, you know, you ought to go hear this man. If you're going to be a clergyman, you ought to know about these things. I mean, I'm not asking you anything, but just go and hear him. See? Well, I went. And I heard him, and he was speaking in Chapel Hill up in Atlantic Highlands, and he did some stuff which I thought was suspicious. He did some paper billets, things, reading. But he said, I talked to him afterwards. He says, if you'd like to come to something more interesting than this, he says, I would see that you're invited. I'm going to be in Philadelphia. Are you at the seminary? I said, yes. Well, anyway, I got a call from Melvin Sutley, who was then superintendent of Wills Eye Hospital. He had a penthouse apartment there. And he was kind of a maitre d' of these subjects. And he had set up a meeting for Arthur Ford to, quote, demonstrate. And that evening, supposedly, nobody that came were known to Arthur Ford. And I was invited, and I brought a friend of mine. His name was Bob Lewis. He was a clergyman. He died in 1996, and also was a grantee of Mrs. Garrett. And at that meeting was Dr. Swan of the Bartow Research Foundation, a number of reporters, people handpicked by Sutley that had credentials. And Ford came in, and he gave his little spiel, and he put on his handkerchief. He told me he could never do it unless he had a Liberty silk. And he went into his supposed trance, say, or disassociation, or whatever. And there was that little jerk quirk, that shivering 3 times, and then the voice appeared, and so on. And he gave something for everyone in the room. It wasn't pablum, it was content. And then he, about 3 weeks later, was heading for New York, and he stopped at my rectory in Florence. And he visited, and he talked with me. At that time, he was interested in the psychic and the church, and he felt that the church, even today, is divesting itself of the mystical, let alone the psychic, which is not necessarily spiritual. He says, before I leave, he says, I'd like to give a reading for you. I didn't ask him for it. And I said, all right. And he sat at a big chair and I recorded it. And he went on and he pulled some things out of the hat that I could never tell you how he could know, even though somebody will say to you, well, you can look up anything. You took a yearbook, you did this. But these were family things that some of which I didn't know, and only my mother knew. You see. Well, anyway, then he got to a point, he says, there is a person here who says he's your teacher. And he says he gives the name Haupt, like that. Haupt. I said, well, I did have a science professor named Dr. Haupt. He says he's still your teacher. He says he wants to tell you something. He says, you know, this was a young clergyman just graduated, so you get a word here that comes in that throws you. For me, at that age, at that beginning, he says he wants to tell you that you were in Florence. I said, Florence? I said, well, I'm in Florence now. That's where we are. No. He says, Italy. He says, you were there. And I said, well, I see. And he says to tell you that you were a disciple of Savonarola. And this accounts with you for a certain puritanical strain that you have had difficulty with since your boyhood. He says, you are only going to be here 3 years at the most. Where you are going will be a big step up for you. I said, well, there's no assurance of that. He says, it could change. Well, anyway, he leaves, other things. About 5 months later, the bishop comes. And as he's leaving, getting in the car, he goes to close the door, and he turns to me and says, you know, Bill, he says, there's a parish opening in Woodbury, New Jersey. He says, I think you'd be very good there. He says, but the rector's been there for 42 years. And he says, I don't know. He's supposed to retire in July. But he says, would you allow me? Would you like me to put your name in? I said, well, it would be very interesting for me. Yes, yes. Well, to make a long story short, the whole thing happened in the sense that the rector didn't retire in July. He retired in August, which was 3 years to the month that I went to Woodbury. And the first week I was in Woodbury, I went to see a lady who had not been to church because she didn't like the canon who I followed. But she came back because I was new. And I went to see her in her apartment. And as I was going out, she said to me, oh, she says, would you like that chair? I said, well, she says, oh, it's a Savonarola chair. She says, you take it with you. It folds up, you know. She says, my father brought it back from Florence many years ago. She says, I want you to have it. I took it. And the former rector, who moved out, his wife said to me, you know, I have a picture here, Bill. You want it? I said, well, wait. She says, oh, it's the monastery of San Marco, where Savonarola was. What are you to say? Just little things like that. You see, you don't know. Now, we know there are alternative explanations for all these things, but it's very subtle. Very subtle, no matter how it works. Whether it works for real, whether it works because people are primed, we don't know. As Marjorie the medium said when she was dying of alcoholism on her bed, and the story was to have come from Mrs. Garrett through Nandor Fodor. When Fodor stood over her bed sitting by her and said, Marjorie, is it true? Is it all true? And she murmured under her breath, you can go to hell. And Fodor said, what did you say? And Marjorie says, all you researchers can go to hell because you'll be thinking of it for the rest of your lives. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions for you?
Yes.
Would you consent to take some questions? Any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Now's your time.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes. I knew you would.
Okay.
Ben
you mentioned that Mrs. Houdini suffered from alcoholism, that
Yes.
Arthur Ford had a problem with the bottle, and that Marjorie had a problem with the bottle.
Yes.
Can you go into any...
Well, it's an occupational hazard. in many aspects of the history of mediumship. It's happened before. It even happened to, I just lost it for a minute here, Satan Moses supposedly went to drink. You see, as Mrs. Garrett, I learned more than I could ever learn in any university from that lady. I could never learn. I had the experiences that I had. Only Mrs. Garrett would have said, well, why don't you go to Germany? Why don't you go to Greece and ask Dr. Tanag some questions? Why don't you go to Germany and see this physicist that I know and ask him about molecular structure and whether or not it's possible for a chair, he thought, to go from one room to ask all these things and write me a report, you see. So she knew the complexities of the mediumistic life, and hers was very much in control and command. But mediumship, which is not as common today because our society is not geared to silence the way it was in days gone by, where people would sit quietly and have quiet time. We are so mentally active and in communication without that. But in the interest of biological efficiency, most of these things are shut out, it seems to me, or we would all be bombing, you see. So mediumship is a specific area which requires, in a true medium, very rare, the giving up of the will. And when you give up the will, you have to be very strong. Otherwise, your psyche can erode. And then it seems to me that you can be rather subject to interferences which may not all be good. I mean, even Mrs. Garrett believed that there was a dark side. And of course, her ability to handle consciousness is where it's at. This whole thing is about the study of consciousness. That's what it's about, and how it functions on its various levels. And that really is the science of the future. It isn't, I know about this, you know, and I know, but it's this that creates the person that has to cope, live, breathe, walk, and function in this realm, in this earthly sphere. So mediumship has had a very, very complex history. And we don't hear as much about it. What we hear today is channeling, which is not at all the same thing. A medium is a person who communicates, supposedly, with the beyond, with the deceased. Now, every time you turn on television, you see von Prague and people like that. Well, it's a mixed bag. And you can easily erase the whole thing, I mean, in terms of him and others. But when you get down to trance-mediumship, the way it used to be studied and looked at and explored and talked about and written about, we don't have a lot of that today. And one has to tread carefully with these things and keep their feet on the ground. You can't keep your feet on the ground all the time. I mean, if Jesus played it safe, he wouldn't have walked on water. You have to take risks, you see. And sometimes you have to delve in. But you must always be alert not to be sidetracked, so that you develop distortions which inhibit your integrated personality. And anyone who wishes to be, like during the psychic revolution, everyone wanted to be psychic. Well, to be psychic is not necessarily to be spiritual. A psychic experience is not a mystical experience. A psychic experience can be very frightening. A mystical experience can be a sense of oneness. You don't find the great monastics and the religious purveyors of self-development floating tables. You don't find them sitting around waiting to get a message. You don't find them working a Ouija board, which is a dangerous doorway to the unconscious. Now, this is why the Parapsychology Foundation is very important, because it is the last bastion of good sense in this whole field. And Mrs. Garrett laid the groundwork, and as far as I'm concerned, she was an amazing, remarkable lady who could shift gears in ways that we're not aware of. So mediumship is a special area. And so is unorthodox healing. So, all these things go in different directions, you see. I had a priest I wrote a book on the use of hypnosis as a pastoral technique. It was a long time ago. And I knew a clergyman who used hypnosis, for example, as a pastoral technique. He was trusted and so on. He wasn't a stage hypnotist or anything, but I saw him do some remarkable things. I saw him do something that I'll share with you that I've never forgotten. He had a woman come into him one time, and you wouldn't do these things today because you'd be afraid you'd be arrested or sued. There's no question about it. The whole pastoral field of the ministry has changed radically. You'd be surprised at the courses you have to take now to be certified as a rector in a church because they're all afraid of being sued. Things you dealt with years ago and took on with no thought whatsoever you wouldn't do now. I mean, a woman comes to you and says, my daughter's possessed. What can I do about my daughter? She is possessed. Now, if you agree right away that the daughter is possessed, you can feed a neurosis, you see. Because it doesn't occur to this woman there may be alternative explanations, you see. A kid comes to you and says, I'm going to jump off the Walt Whitman Bridge in Philadelphia next week. And you talk to him and you say, well, Charles, if you jump off the bridge, have you ever thought that if you do that, you might destroy your body, but you might still have your same problems? Have you ever considered that? And you help him. And he goes home. And everything appears all right. 5 months later, he jumps off the Walt Whitman Bridge, and you get a call from the lawyers, and they want to know, what did you say to this young man that may have contributed to his jumping off the Walt Whitman Bridge? So all of that is now in a different perspective, you see. Did I get away from your question?
How did he use hypnosis?
Oh, yes, I was talking about the lady, yes. So he had this lady came to him, thank you. See, he's older than I am, but he remembered it. This lady came to him, Dr. Roy Grace. He was at Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. He's deceased many years now. I think I wrote this up in the Spiritual Frontier book, which incidentally, they would not title A Priest Explores the Psychic World, they said, because when you get down south, the word priest would take away from the sales of the book. That was at that time. But this woman came in, and she was turned this way. There's a word for that, torquil.
Bell's palsy?
No, well, she was just stuck this way. And she'd been to psychiatrist, she'd been to physician, she's been everywhere. Husband had spent a fortune on her. Finally, she winds up in Dr. Grace's study with her husband. He says, I don't know what to do. Anyway, he gives her a session and does hypnotic therapy with her. On the second session, he takes her back. Now, he takes her back to when she's 10 years old. Where were you then? He takes her back to when she's 9 years old. Where are you then? And she suddenly clinches up and she says, I'm at my party. And he says, oh, you're at your party. Is it what party? My birthday party. Oh, who's at your birthday party? My father, my mother, and my uncle. Oh, your uncle. I can't even look at him. Well, it's years ago, it was a case of child abuse. And the unconscious retained it, the conscious mind put it out, and of course it surfaces in these unusual ways, and here it caused that. When she left there, she did not have that, and she was normal, and she's normal ever since. Now, those are things that can happen, don't happen all the time, but that's an example, you see. So there again, as a therapeutic technique in the right hands, these things can be helpful. That's a lot different from somebody holding a candle on somebody's hand or trying to pull a tooth with amnesia, hypnotic amnesia. And it's a lot different than a Kreskin telling you that hypnosis doesn't exist. You must be very alert to all of the contemporary efforts in interest in parapsychology and psychic research on a performing level, where all the lingo and language is used, but there's no substance inwardly of any belief. And you're made to believe, and they go away not believing a thing, and you've been duped. That's a current trend. always remember, as I said to Lizette, if people could read minds, they wouldn't need envelopes. And there are more people that wear blindfolds and can see than you can shake a stick at. One of the great magicians that I've known, an old-timer, John Calvert, flew a plane blindfolded over Nashville. And he said once, he says, you know, he said, it's really remarkable, Bill, how much you can see through a pinhole. I said, well, suppose they put the tape on your eyes and you can't see. Oh, he says, well, he says, what you do, he says, you just have them keep putting on tape until you can see. So there's that whole area, you see, of mentalism which came in on the psychic revolution and the decline of big magic shows and things. Everybody wanted to do everything remarkable, but they didn't want to be a magician. So the mind readers of the old times with their turbans have now become the sort of intellectual purveyors of words about parapsychology and fool you. They love to fool researchers. They love it. They just love it. And they'll set you up, and they'll send people to do the tests with you, and they'll bend spoons for you, and you'll be amazed, and you'll write it up as a paper, and then they'll expose you. And they'll strut their stuff as the ones who really know, instead of helping you. That's my point about the use of people who know these things. Yes, sir?
Houdini, at least sometimes argued that his main complaint with spiritualism was that it caused insanity.
Yes.
I find that very different from what I expected to find when reading about Houdini, and I was wondering if you could comment.
Well, he tried to say that all these people are going crazy. The evidence was that there weren't that many crazy people who were interested in spiritualism. I mean, take Jay Abbott, for example, the man who I met and talked to. I mean, he was the sweetest man you'd ever meet. I mean, even with his spiritualist beliefs, he was more integrated than people I've dealt with who have vast degrees who are bonkers. I mean, I know a woman whose husband was a psychiatrist. She went away for the weekend. He stayed home and ate chocolate bars and drank Coca-Cola, and she had to come home and put him in the hospital. Jay Abbott, in his sweet way, with his simplistic faith, was really a very nice gentleman. So, as far as driving people, sometimes people's odd interests hold them together rather than disintegrating them. And they're better with what they believe. I've seen it happen many times. The only time when it got out of hand, I saw a lot of it, was during the psychic revolution, when there were a lot of pastoral problems, when everybody was trying to develop ESP, you see. And of course, many of them, if they didn't know the difference between spiritual development of the inner life compared to wanting to know things and feel that they were getting messages and all this kind of thing. And many of them that got into trouble were people who were unhappy in their personal lives. They had terrible marriages, you see. They were personally miserable, and this just threw them right off the cliff. So there was a whole pastoral thing there during that era.
But was that in general Houdini's prime argument?
No, Houdini's argument was that there was nothing that he ever discovered that had any semblance of reality as real. And the question I made was, even if he did, Houdini was the kind of man that, as a friend of mine told me, there was a train crash. If he could get near it, he'd lay down and get the publicity that he was in the train crash. He was very ruthless. And if you came up on stage with chains and locks, a whole bunch of them you might be called to the side and thrown bodily out the door. His men did not hesitate to beat people up who interfered. He was a very domineering man. And he ruled the roost, and he caused chaos in all kinds of situations. He made quite a name for himself. The exposure business came at the end of the career. It wasn't long, and it wasn't a moneymaker. It wasn't a moneymaker. Neither was the movies. He was not a good movie actor. And as a romantic lead, he was terrible. Yes?
Could you clarify the fate of the message in the bank vault vis-a-vis...
Oh, nobody ever saw it.
Right, so that when Arthur Ford came up with his statement of what the message was. Nobody said, let's go to the vault and see what it is?
No, there's no record of that paper existing anywhere. John Mulholland, who was a scholar of magic, at one point he left his entire collection to the Players Club, and they sold it, said there never was a message.
But I had heard that on the 50th anniversary of his death, there was some secret bank vault that was going to be opened, and and that we would know finally what was inside.
No, someone had this theory that there were secrets buried out in the cemetery, in the tomb, and the head's been knocked off. How many times, Stanley?
2 or 3, I don't know.
Stanley's an expert on Houdini. Yeah, 2 or 3 times, and smashed it, and they put it up now. So, no, there was never any paper that Dunninger came up with a message too. They all got in on it. It was like a Mad Hatter's Tea Party. It's marvelous characters, and they're all in the book. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just to clarify, if you're telling us that the Houdini Code was a put-up job between his wife
Yes.
and Arthur Ford, I'm not clear then why his wife turned around and retracted her endorsement of this. What's going on?
Because she got in a jam. She realized that she'd made a mistake. She wanted to get out of it. And that was the only way to do it. And then she disavowed the whole thing after she did. She wrote a tremendous letter to Walter Winchell, who flagged it all across the Mr. and Mrs. Marion, all the North and South Marion, all the ships at sea. But it just was, she made a terrible mistake. Just to show you the value of Houdini even today, this is current in a magazine this month. That's a fountain pen, right? Now on that fountain pen is soldered a key. The key is supposed to be from Houdini's keys, all right? And the fountain pen you can get either in gold or you can get it in platinum or, The platinum one is $9,500. The sterling one's $975. The white gold one's $2,800. There's where it's at. And nothing's going to change. A Houdini poster can go for $15,000. A letter, $3,000. A postcard, $1,000. Go out and find some Houdini material. You'll be wealthy. You'll be able to go to Palm Beach. Yes, sir.
Do you have any theory as to why Houdini was never able to come back and communicate?
Well, if I said because he was dead. But it just didn't. You have to understand the Houdini saga is a bunch of material that's sculptured around a lot of inconsistencies. The writer, Kenneth Silverman, did a very wonderful job. He's a Pulitzer Prize writer on his biography of Houdini. If you wanted to read that, you would have a further insight just called Houdini. That's available. Kenneth Silverman. My story takes place after Houdini's death, in which Mr. Silverman said in his notes published beyond the book that he, like everything else, even as an author, he did not consider that his book was the last word. There's always room for something more on Houdini. It will never go away. When Clinton got into trouble, they said, why, he's pulled a Houdini. So you see, it's a household word. Every kid on the street knows who Houdini is. Nothing will change. That is stamped into the unconscious mind and conscious mind of all of America, all of Europe. Houdini. That's why he always gets publicity, you see. It should, Arthur Ford, that's best. He's very interesting, but you see, he's not going to get, this is the guy that draws it. He'll still get a headline. It's amazing, just fascinating. Well, we don't want to go on. We all have... Look, I want to thank you all for coming. I am very pleased that you took the time to come, and it's been a great privilege for me to share with you. And I thank you very much, and I thank the Parapsychology Foundation with all my heart for many years. This is deja vu for me, and I want to thank several other friends for coming, especially Marsden Bond, legend in parapsychology, Dr. Holzer, who is here tonight, my friend Stanley Palm, who's the Houdini expert, who will tell me afterwards what I didn't know. My George Hansen, and thank you so much, Lizette.
Thank you.
When he give that invocation, bringing back Houdini, Mrs. Houdini was there.
Everybody keeps saying that. It was not on purpose. About the lecture, but it's
Or parapsychology in general?
it's about the foundation, but also including some of the color bits. Hi, I'm Linda. I am. Nice to meet you.
Put a face with
Yeah,
a voice.
yeah. Nice to meet you. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Nice woman.
Yeah. Oh, don't worry about that. Goes black. So just like throw them off for like that split second. And then very, very.
You know, when you don't have
I'll give you my card.
Dr. Holzer, This is good. That's good. Yeah.
You don't have another thing there.
Dr. Holzer worked on there. Oh, really?
Yeah, I in 1946, and I was young and foolish, and I'm older and foolish.
No, he's a gold mine of information. And he knows.
That was the lecture I...
See, I'm learning.
You are.
I'm learning. There you
are.
go.
Okay, here's my card, and that says a page and voicemail, but it's really my cell phone.
And you asked a question about what was your specific question?
Well, I mentioned that Bess Houdini had alcoholism, Martha Ford had alcoholism.
I was waiting for you to say Eileen Garrett.
No, I
because she liked a good drink, but she wasn't.
No. But my question is